Is it maximized? All right, cool.
Yes.
All right. So hi, everyone. This will be a pretty quick talk. This kind of came up due to my setup, and I dropped in a week or two ago into the Saturday's Python group and somehow mentioned that I use WSL2 in Windows. And there were some people who were curious about it. So I said, I'll do a five-minute lightning talk about it because maybe it's not common knowledge, and I'll kind of explain my own route here. And I'm also going to throw in a little Docker bit at the end because there was also some people who were like asking questions about Docker, and I figured I'd show for me, my experience, the shortest path as I've kind of fully embraced it. Probably a lot later than a lot of other people, but I'll show the shortest path to using Docker in Python, which is very helpful in terms of this setup. All right, so the first thing is why in the world would you want to do that, developing for Linux on Windows? And so here's a couple of the reasons. And first of all, you get a lot more hardware power for your money with PC hardware than, for instance, on a Mac, which I think is the place where I was coming from. And possibly you're thinking about building a machine learning experimentation box anyway. And this was, of course, last year before GPUs became utterly inaccessible. And so, it's actually a great way to get a little more power. And then you maybe had a MacBook Pro that was more than a year old and suddenly magically started just not performing anywhere near what you want. And possibly you were using a Mac and you're using Docker and you would like it not to really be really slow, because that was my experience certainly with Docker on the Mac. I don't know if it's changed in the last year and a half, but it was never great. And possibly you're dual booting, you already have Ubuntu installed, and maybe that was the first thing you did with your cool new PC, but then you realize that Ubuntu can just never get the screen resolutions to match up across different monitors in a nice way, and you were really kind of sick of that. So anyway, these are possible reasons why you'd want to do this. So enter WSL2, which I found out about at the time. So what is Windows Subsystem for Linux v2? And I'll put the direct quote here. It's a subsystem for Linux lets developers run a Linux environment fully within Windows without a virtual machine, but actually it just basically maps the system calls from your Linux install straight to the Windows system calls, which is definitely some black magic as far as I can tell. I'll show some boxes and arrows that I think approximates it here. So more specifically, it's pretty complicated, but it's WSL, rather than the traditional way of running Linux in Windows or vice versa, on a Mac or whatever, rather than having a virtual machine that emulates an entire computer running on your operating system. Instead, it's just an emulation layer that takes your Linux system calls, so opening files, talking to USB or whatever, talking to the network. And so when your Linux software talks to the system calls, this emulation layer, WSL, basically routes them directly to the Windows system calls and provides a really amazing level of interoperability. It's super fast, so you don't have to kind of go all the way down the whole machine abstraction virtualization and then back up again and then back down again and up again through a lot of code that is useless in the sense of kind of particulars of Linux file systems and everything else and block devices and all that stuff. It's really fast. It's also kind of crazy how interoperable in that you can go into your bash prompt running in Linux effectively on top of Linux system calls, and you can run Windows executable files, and you can pretty much interact in a lot of ways between the two. And then you also basically have, already everything kind of comes pre-mounted and talking to each other. So you can have stuff on your regular, desktop, and you can access it from your Linux installation that you're working on. So the ultra simplified thing here, I didn't get to the arrows here, but the first row is the WSL2 version, and the second row is the previous version, very much abstracted. One, you go from bash to your Linux syscalls to WSL, which jumps straight to Windows syscalls, whereas the other one, you go from bash to Linux syscalls to, probably an emulated Linux kernel on top of a big fat emulated virtual machine with all sorts of virtual stuff like block devices and, disk storage and network devices and all that stuff, and then climb all the way back out to Windows syscalls. You can imagine that adds a lot of extra effort. And that's in terms of the traditional Windows virtual machine setup. Someone on Reddit made this fancy diagram which shows some of the black magic. I'm not going to try to explain it, but it even has something from Plan 9 in it for those who really want to go get deep. Plan 9 is a cool operating system, or at least everyone told me it was cool back in college in the early 2000s. So anyway, what else is cool about this? So Docker support is kind of first class in the sense that their Docker desktop for Windows runs on top of WSL2 or can run on top of WSL2, and it really runs pretty seamlessly. And so you can basically pop open your Linux terminal in Windows, and you can run Docker Compose, and just about everything works. So this is my kind of what the heck 2021. I get this is a year or two old, but still can run an executable, Windows executable from my bash prompt with my little Linux icon in Windows, and I can pipe it through grep, and then I can just run some Docker Compose. Wow. Yeah, also me using Windows after I swore it off, and again, 2005 or something like that. Who knows? So what else? Everyone's favorite, monoculture of development IDs, Visual Studio Code naturally works perfectly on this big tangled pile. So you can open your Linux terminal in Windows, that little Linux button, and then you type code dot wherever you're located in your Linux file system, because there's kind of two separate file systems, and it pops up with Visual Studio Code already kind of tapped in, and the command line that pops up in Linux in Visual Studio Code is already running bash and has like everything plugged into your Linux environment right there, which is really nice. So here's my kind of, again, snapshot down below. You see I've got a terminal, I write code dot and pops up, and you can see above I do my control whatever, and you can see I've got, so you install like a version of Linux, a distribution on top of your WSL2. So I installed Ubuntu, and so it just runs everything there, and it's all plugged in there in Windows. So why wouldn't you do this? First of all, Windows, yeah, not the best, most secure OS historically. Maybe feels a little dangerous these days. Going to the grocery store feels dangerous. So I don't know. But also maybe you actually know how to configure your monitors in Ubuntu and dual boot that, and don't want to play Windows video games once in a while. And maybe you actually want to do ML research on your fat GPU that you've got. Unfortunately, the Docker GPU stuff in WSL2 running on top of this whole crazy stack isn't quite working without doing beta stuff here and there. Supposedly it's coming soon, but that's not fully ironed out pathway yet. Like the same thing with they don't really have a good, I think it's still a pretty big kludge to run GUI apps, Linux GUI apps in Windows via WSL2, but I think that's all very much like high priority right now at Microsoft, and they're trying to push that through. And finally, if you do need an Apple machine for reasons like you're developing Apple Pay or something like that, or you just like them better, which totally cool, they are pretty good, then that is another reason not to do this. But other than that, I'll stop there, and then I guess I'll just jump straight forward to my quick two slides of Docker, and someone can ask me to do more of this, or if you've all heard Docker then and use Docker, then don't worry about it. So if you want to do Docker, if you're running Windows and you want to check it out, install Docker, install WSL2, and then create a Docker Compose file in a folder. And I'll show you a super minimal example, and you can just run Docker Compose up, and everything's there. And it's nice because you can run multiple versions of Python. You can add all sorts of cool other systems to your stack. And here's my couple pieces here. I'll post this on Meetup if anyone asks, or someone send me a chat if they want this minimal with those. The first file is the Docker Compose file. The second is a Docker file. And the nice part is that you can have a requirements of text in your local folder, and it basically runs your entire Python program in Docker with Docker Compose. And so you can have lots of different Python environments, and it's even better, in my opinion, it's much better than virtual environment because you really kind of separate things out. And then here's a more advanced example of, sorry for the terrible screenshots, I was running through this, but you can see you got down here a DB. If you want Postgres to simply be pulled into your little Docker setup, it's really trivial to do that and expose a port and set that up. Anyway, that was a slight diversion. That's all. So I guess anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.